Hey, what's up? This is Dion Lewis, founder of Healthy Project Media and the host of the Healthy Project podcast. Join me as I speak with change makers who are doing the work and sharing their stories, insights, and innovations to close gaps in healthcare for everyone. Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Healthy Project podcast. I am your host, Dion Lewis. And today we're going to be diving into a topic that affects millions of Americans, but doesn't always get the attention I feel like it deserves in the healthcare conversation. And it's that critical connection between housing and health. And my guest today, Dr. Margot Kushel, she's a physician and the director of the USF. Is it Benioff Homelessness and Housing?
UCSF, the UCSF Benioff Homelessness and
Yeah,
Housing
Benioff
Initiative. Yeah.
Homelessness and Housing Initiative, as well as the Action Research Center for Health at the University of California, San Francisco. And we're going to be having a great conversation today. Dr. Kushel, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Corey.
Yeah, of course. So, before, we kind of get into the conversation, can you tell the people a little bit more about yourself, and kind of what gets you up in the morning?
Sure. So my name is Margot Kushel. I am a practicing general internist, and I've been practicing at San Francisco General Hospital for over 30 years now, which is a safety net hospital of the city and county of San Francisco. But early on in my career at San Francisco General, I began to see the devastating effects of homelessness on health. And so I actually devote a lot of my time now to trying to understand that phenomenon. More importantly, understanding what will end homelessness, what will make people experiencing homelessness healthier, how the healthcare system can be involved in both preventing and ending homelessness. So I spend a lot of my time doing research, talking to policymakers, and I guess I'm driven by an unending drive to try to end homelessness. Nobody in America, nobody really in any country should spend a night on the streets.
Man, I love it. I love it. When we had our initial kind of pre-podcast conversation, you had talked about homelessness is a housing problem.
Yeah,
Um, can
yeah,
you unpack what that means and why
yeah,
like healthcare professionals need
yeah.
to understand this perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think particularly as healthcare professionals, but also just for general observers,
Hmm.
when we ask people what causes this problem, they often go to health problems, mental health and substance use problems, which are health problems that are extremely stigmatized and seem visible. People walk by a person experiencing homelessness on the street and they might notice them having a mental health crisis or a substance use problem. But really, at its heart, homelessness is a housing problem. That when you compare regions of the country with high rates of homelessness to regions with low rates of homelessness, what separates them is not how much mental health or substance use problems their community members have. And it's interestingly not how much poverty is in the community. It really is all about the mismatch between the cost of housing and lower incomes people ability to afford it. So when we look at regions of the country with high amounts of homelessness, those are regions where there are a lot of low income people who are unable to afford their housing because housing prices are too high, because affordable housing doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that mental health and substance use don't have a big role. Obviously, if you need to work 2.5 jobs and crowd into housing,
Right.
in order to afford it, you're having a mental health crisis, you're going to be the first person out. These are conditions that interfere with social functioning. Makes sense that if you're on the rat race to try to hold on to your housing, it's harder. And then the flip side is also true. Once people become homeless, their mental health conditions really go south, get much worse. They tend to have more substance use, often using it to try to cope with the conditions. And also everything that is in our toolkit to be able to help people with those problems kind of goes out the window. So related to health problems, related to mental health and substance use, but really caused by the desperate lack of affordable housing in this country.
Yeah, which, is doesn't feel like it's getting better
Yeah.
anytime soon.
No.
And these problems are going to continue to persist. And
Yes.
I can only imagine as a provider, it and definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like it could feel like, man, what I'm doing everything I can within my
Yeah.
power, and there's this one
Yeah.
thing that is just kind
Yeah.
of making it worse, and it made me
Yeah.
feel like there's no control.
Yeah. And I think that's true on two ways. One is that we see a lot of discourse from elected officials, from the general public, in the media. For instance, blaming the homeless service sector, saying we're pouring all this money into homelessness, why isn't it getting better? And I like to say the homeless service sector is essentially important, but what they're trying to do is keep people alive while they're homeless, right? They're trying to
Mhm.
like quench the fire, as it were. It's sort of like blaming the emergency department, nurses, and physicians for the pandemic. That doesn't make, like, they weren't responsible, but thank
Right,
God they were there to help us out, right? And so it's the same thing.
right,
I keep seeing the homeless service sector getting blamed for this crisis, which doesn't make any sense. And certainly as a healthcare provider, one of the reasons that devote so much time to this, even though I spent so much time in medical school and residency learning how to be a physician, is that when I'm sitting in a room with a patient, I can be like the best doctor I can possibly be. I can have the best crew working with me, the nurses, the medical assistants, the nutritionists, everyone. And we could be totally on our game. But if our patients are experiencing homelessness, our hands are tied behind our back. And it is incredibly disheartening. It's incredibly distressing. Sometimes then you get these reports like, oh, the patient's diabetes is out of control, their blood pressure is out of control. Doctor, don't you know how to treat their diabetes? And it's like, well, I do know how to treat their diabetes. But
right.
the patient I'm taking care of is living in a tent, right? He's like has to leave his tent to try to find a meal at a free meal program and is worried about his stuff being stolen. He's got a lot of things on his mind that are actually more important in that moment than taking their diabetes medicine or eating a low carb diet.
Right. And something that I'm noticing too, you know, when, you know, when we're gathering some of those some of that social needs data
Yes.
for a lot of the individuals that we serve, if they are experiencing homelessness, they've already ran through a lot of the resources. So
Yes.
it's almost like
Yeah.
what's what's
What's
next?
next? And I love that we're gathering social needs data. It's super, important. It can be a little traumatic sometimes for patients, but I get it. Like, I get why we're doing it. But this problem is so outsized. Like, this
Yeah.
problem is so huge. We are in such a deep hole. Like, across our country, we have, I think, 36 units of housing that are affordable and available for every 100 extremely low income households. Extremely low income household is any household that makes less than 30% of the median income of whatever area they live in. In the regions of the country with really visible and terrible homelessness crises, let's take San Francisco, 24 units of housing affordable and available for every 100 extremely low income household. We're a
Mm,
million units short. And so sometimes it feels like what is in our control as a healthcare provider feels like putting band-aids on, and sometimes that's what we need to
right.
do, and it's all good, like we need band-aids. But I think I got really interested in using my voice as a physician to say, as I like to say, there is no medicine as powerful as housing. That if I actually cared about my patient's health, my community's health, and I do care deeply about those things, maybe the best use of my time is to work with policymakers, to work with the public, to work with the media, to understand how absolutely critical it is that we solve our housing crisis, and that everything flows from that. Our mental health system needs a lot of help. No question.
Right.
No question about that. Not denying it. You know, but it's hard to have a well functioning mental health system if the people the system is trying to serve are sleeping on the streets or are incredibly stressed because they're working two jobs and keep getting eviction notices, and they're doing the best they can. And so, in my mind, yeah, the health system has a lot of problems and it needs to work on them. But I think as healthcare providers or as healthcare advocates, as people in this space, we also need to recognize our limitations, where the value of healthcare ends, and use our relatively loud voices. Like, people listen to people who come and tell them about
Yeah.
healthcare stories, healthcare expertise. Use our voices, get involved, and say, we can't solve this problem through the healthcare system alone. We need to get to the root of the problem, which is, incredible income inequality, a failed housing system, incredible amounts of racism and structural racism that has really made this problem disproportionately impact the Black community, Indigenous community. Um, and I feel like we need to use our voices to speak out of what our communities need to be healthy communities.
No, I love that. I love that. And I want to touch on something you said that I think is extremely important. And I don't know if it's a fear thing for a lot of providers, but like, your voice carries a lot of weight
Yeah,
in
yeah,
all of these conversations,
yeah,
from housing to
yeah,
food insecurity.
yeah,
And what is that collaboration between provider and public health
yeah,
service, like, what could that look like? Like, what are some of the things that you're doing or you're seeing that have been successful?
yeah. I do think sometimes I wonder why, but I do think the public still listens to physicians and to nurses. And the public certainly spends a lot of money on healthcare, right? We
Yeah.
kind of like, if I want to order an MRI, I can pretty much order an MRI, and but if I want to make sure my patient has $1,000 to pay back rent, that's a lot harder. And I think that we sometimes feel like, oh, it's not our role, it's not our place. But I guess I'm really called by the question, like, if not me, who?
Mhm.
And I think it's most important that we obviously platform the people who are at the center of this. And so a lot of my work, a lot of my organization's work has been done to bring into the organization, to pay, to platform people who have lived this crisis in their own lives. But I also think it would be derelict if we as healthcare providers are not out there. And when I say out there, it may be in your church. It may be in
Right.
your PTA group. It may be at a local community meeting where people are, usually homeowners, are
Yeah.
railing against affordable housing in their community, and to speak out as a healthcare provider and to tell the stories. You can hide people's personal details because we're so trained appropriately not to share personal identifiable details, but you can tell the story writ whole, writ large, of what this housing crisis is doing to our communities and our patients. I think it's also important that we speak about the reality of the intersection between health and homelessness. It's not that people's eyes are deceiving them. It's not that there isn't a dramatically increased
Mhm.
prevalence of mental health and substance use disorders. Sure, there is. But also to explain the directionality there, to explain how this works, to explain in communities where there is less of a housing crunch, those folks are living inside their own homes. And yes, do we need to do a lot more in our mental health space? Of course we do. But we could have the most perfect mental health system. And if we don't fix the housing crisis, people are still going to be housed. And also, I think it's fair to say we can't get our own house in order
Mhm.
unless we have the housing to send people to. That I got tired of getting like penalized for readmissions, that patients aren't supposed to come back to the hospital right after they leave. That's usually a sign that the
Right.
healthcare system isn't functioning well. When the reality is, when they left the hospital, they were sleeping on a sidewalk.
Yeah, they were coming back anyway.
They were coming back
Yeah.
anyway. And we have to be there with open arms to help them, right? But I think it's fair for us to say, hey, stop. Um, let's talk about the root of the problem. And I think not just like as an excuse. I don't want healthcare providers to like use this as an excuse to not do their jobs, but
Right.
I sort of think it's like calls us to action. It calls us to action. It's not enough to say, hey, don't blame me for their readmission, but it should inspire us to be out on the streets saying, look, I know how to treat substance use disorders. It doesn't always work. Nothing I do always works. No
Mhm.
medical illness has a 100% success rate. That's not how this game
Right.
is played, right? But I know that I can't do it if someone's homeless. I know what my patients say to me in the privacy of the exam room. I know that they tell me that they know they have a problem, that they desperately want it to stop. But right now, their highest priority is a place to sleep. I know what it means when the 63-year-old woman who's worked a full time job her entire life, and her body is starting to break down by the hard, physically demanding work that she does. And she develops a health problem, like many of us do, and more of us
Mhm.
do as our age advances. I know what it's like when she comes to my visit and confesses in the privacy of my office that she has not had any food in 4 days because she spent her last dollar trying to fight off an eviction because she knows when she's evicted, she'll be on the street and she's never surviving that. And I think we
Man, that's
need to
hard.
shout those stories from the rooftops. I think we need to break this logjam conversation of blaming the homelessness sector for doing their job. I think we absolutely need to call out the amount of the ways that racism has shaped this conversation and the fact that, for instance, Black folks are 4 to 5-fold overrepresented in the homeless population. And that is not because of more mental
Mm.
health or substance use problems. They actually, if anything, have lower rates of those problems across the board. And I think we need to say that we hear you. We also don't want our neighbors sleeping on the streets. We get that you don't
Mhm.
want your kids walking by an encampment. Guess what? I don't want mine either. And I don't want to walk by it either because I don't want there to be an encampment, not because I want to disappear people, but I want all the residents of that encampments to know the safety and security of home.
Mhm. Oh, I love that. I would love to talk more about you brought it up, and there's that the structural racism, and how people of color, black people specifically, are disproportionately affected by this. Can you talk more about that, and
Sure.
um, what are some of the things that you're seeing or noticing?
Yeah. Well, there's like a particular poignancy to this because, in some ways, the housing system is how this country, weaponized race. It was one of the ways that it did.
Mhm.
And I think it was Nicole Hannah Jones who once said, like, the North and the West didn't need Jim Crow; they had zoning laws.
Mhm.
But in not just talking about obviously the incredible trauma and horror of enslavement and the loss of material wealth and all of that, but even if you just take it to our modern era, in the post World War II era, was the greatest increase in home ownership. Right, Americans bought homes, and home ownership is the single biggest mechanism for intergenerational wealth transfer in our country. And
Mhm.
Black Americans were intentionally shut out of that. They were shut out of it through policies like redlining, where areas were basically zoned for only white folks, and you couldn't sell your house to anyone who wasn't white. And then the areas where Black folks could live in, the banks basically said, oh, if you live in this area, you're too risky. You can't get a mortgage. Or if you get a mortgage, you get it at really terrible rates. And that became illegal in the late 1960s with fair housing laws. But if you came down from Mars and tried to guess where those red lines were, you could still draw them because the truth is we still live in those invested
Mm.
and
Right.
disinvested areas. And that lack of ability to sort of buy into this boom of wealth is one of the single biggest contributors to the wealth gap between white families and Black families. And that operates in a couple of ways. One is if your family has wealth, it's easier to protect someone who's going through a hard time. You're more likely to have $5,000 to help your brother pay back rent. The other really important thing is if you're a homeowner, you have a lot more ability to protect family members in other ways. Because if that brother needs to move out, he can move into your home. But
Right.
if you're a renter, your landlord has the right to say, oh, they're not on the lease, they can't move in, right? And so it left Black families with less intergenerational wealth, with less access to sort of control over their housing, and left them living in areas that were disinvested in. Because, when you think about how did we fund our schools? Through local property taxes, they were invested in disinvested areas. You add that really, oh, and by the way, that has been illegal since the civil rights era. But like when they do secret shopper experiments,
Oh
they'll
yeah.
like create like the same rental resume and have a Black person and a white person go. Only changes the name and the color of the person doing it, but they'll have like the same income and the same number of kids, maybe the same eviction, same amount of money in the bank, like whatever. And when they do those, they show that white folks are much more likely to be offered their rental housing. So this means that Black folks wind up paying more for lower quality housing because they have fewer options, right? You saw the mortgage crisis in 2008, how Black and brown households were targeted for these really terrible
Hmm.
mortgage deals and stuff. So you add to that like what's pretty well described discrimination in our criminal legal system. You add to that discrimination in the employment system, similar secret shopper experiments of job
Right.
applications, same story, right? And then the not only the discrimination in our educational system, but also like who gets to go to fancy public schools and who doesn't, which has to do with what neighborhoods you live in.
Yep.
Maybe it isn't a surprise that Black folks are fourfold overrepresented. It may not be a surprise, but it should be a galling shame. And I'm, as a white woman, always kind of shocked when I'm in these spaces and everyone's like yelling about mental health and substance use. And I'm like, hey, the big disproportionality is, San Francisco, my city, down to, I think the last report, down to less than 5% of the population identifies as Black. It's been plummeting, right, for the last 15 years. 37% of folks experiencing homelessness are. I mean, that's a
Wow.
wild disproportionality. But when people yell and scream, they're not like, oh my God, this is a marker of something we
Right.
should be deeply, deeply, deeply troubled by and we should be working to fix. Um, I think it's not a surprise that people, pick on mental health and substance use because those are deeply stigmatized medical conditions. When someone
Right.
develops, I don't know, heart disease, we don't totally blame it on them, but like we treat people with mental health and substance use problems as if they're intentionally doing bad
Right.
things. I, I think I'm not here to say that people experiencing homelessness don't have disproportionate rates of those. Of course they do. I'm not here to say that it isn't upsetting to walk by and see it. And I'm not here to say that our health system to help people with mental health or substance use problems is perfect. Like there are lots of reasonable people can have very good discussions about
Right.
like when someone is able to make decisions for self. Those are like difficult conversations, but conversations we need to have. None of that gets to the fact that the reason we have this crisis is that we've got this incredible shortage of affordable housing. And none of that gets to the fact that who we know loses out in that conversation, you know?
Yeah, 100%. There's a population of homeless that I'm really interested in your thoughts on too. Are those that we don't necessarily see as homeless? Like yeah,
Yes.
when
Yes.
people think
Yeah.
when you think homeless, you think on the street, living in
Yes.
a tent. But there are those that are living in their car
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
couch surfing.
Yeah.
That is still a population. They're homeless. They don't have
Yes.
their own
Yes.
home, and they're
Yeah.
they're also having those same issues.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's really important. And thank you for bringing that up. I think there are a couple of different issues here. One is definitional, that the federal government like decided they had to draw a line in who's homeless and gets our services and who doesn't. And they excluded a lot of folks whose health is distinctly suffering. People living permanently in long stay motels are sort of on the borderline of whether the federal government considers them homeless or not. I'm going to give a shout out to an amazing book by Brian Goldstone, There Is No Place for Us. It's absolutely incredible ethnography of families in Atlanta, Georgia, who've really been pushed out by the gentrification, by the privatization of housing in that community, and are living back and forth between, extended stay hotels, shelters, outdoors, their cars, etc. And one of the things that book really points out is how incredibly invisible and hidden this population is. And that when people are yelling and screaming about homelessness, they're not even thinking about that. But I also want to point out other folks who are totally invisible. How many like Uber drivers I know are
Mm,
sleeping in their car? And sometimes I travel a lot for work. I try to take public transportation before I land home really late. I hop in an Uber. And how often when I pop open the trunk, I see what I know is all of someone's stuff because they're living in that car. How many
wow.
of my patients tell me that? How many people are shift workers, not getting fast food workers, working in cafes? How many people are janitors, often for health systems? This really kills me. For health systems with like the hospital doesn't technically employ them, they're a contractor and they're not guaranteed, their
Yep.
hours, and really treated terribly. They're living in their car. And the public doesn't see these folks as experiencing homelessness. They're living in their car. They're doing everything they can to stay out of public view because if they do, they might get arrested or harassed. They've got their membership at, Planet Fitness for
Right.
$10 a month so they can go and shower. How many of our college students, in California at our CSUs, California State Universities, at our UCs, at our community college, how many of our college students are couch surfing and living in their car? They're
Man.
living in their car one night a week. They stay at a friend's house. That is devastating to your health, to your mental health, to your ability to stay in school. How many people are hidden? We now know among single homeless adults, those are adults not living with their kids, over the age of 25. Almost half of them at any one time are 50 and older. And of those 50 and older, over 40% had never been homeless before the age of 50. These were the men and women who have worked their whole lives, have
Right.
hung on. It's sort of like my patient I was talking about earlier. You get to be 55, your body's kind of breaking down. It's hard to keep up the two jobs you've been keeping on
Right.
4 hours of sleep. Landlord sees an opportunity because you fall behind in your rent to evict you. They can then turn that property over and rent it to a much higher rent to like the new tech worker, and you're out on the
Yeah.
street and you're never getting back.
Man, that is tough. That is so tough. And it reminds me of a story I heard a couple years ago where a woman and her daughter had amoxicillin, wasn't getting well. Come to find out, she was living in a garage and
Yeah.
wasn't able to refrigerate the amoxicillin.
Yeah.
That's why the ear infection wasn't going away.
Yeah.
And she didn't even think she was homeless because
Right.
the garage technically had an address, but
Right.
she had no access to anything.
Right. And I think, when I talk to folks experiencing homelessness, I've had this experience a lot where someone's living in their car and I will say, hey, can I record you as homeless? Only because one, we want to document how common this is. And two,
Mhm.
it will help folks understand. So if they give you insulin and your insulin and they tell you to put it in the fridge, that's not an option, right? That's not an option.
Yeah.
And people are like, well, I'm not homeless. I live in my car. And I think that comes partially from how stigmatized homelessness has become. How much we talk terribly about people experiencing homelessness. The language, if you just look at the language in your
Yeah.
newspaper that politicians use, first of all, everyone thinks people experiencing homelessness come from someplace else. It's kind of absurd. Like everywhere you go, everyone is convinced that people come from someplace else. Everyone
Yeah.
is accusing everyone else. And I'm like, wait, so you lose your housing,
Right.
you have no money, like you're going to pick up and drive someplace else, usually much more expensive. Like when we looked at this in California, we did this huge study that California, statewide study of people experiencing homelessness, a huge study of adult homelessness in California, all available on our website. Encourage you to check it out. We found out that 9 of 10 people had lost their stable housing in California. 75% were living in the same county they were living in. Now, I switch counties every day to go to work,
Right.
that of the 10% who hadn't lost their housing in California, like about half of them were Californians who had like moved someplace else. And then when things went bad, tried to come home. So even those folks were like super Californians,
Yeah.
And yet everyone in California, like every policymaker is convinced that like everyone is like flooding from Kansas to California. And sometimes I'm like, stop and think about it for a second.
Yeah.
You lose your housing. Everything you have is on your back. You don't have enough
Right.
money for food. And what you're going to do is hightail out to the most expensive housing market in the country. Like, why would you even do that? It doesn't even make logical sense,
That
really.
doesn't make a whole lot of sense. No, not
Doesn't
at
make all.
all.
And then people were like, well, is that true? Maybe they're lying to you. And I was like, well, first of all, like, why people aren't like sitting there thinking like, how can I fool those people? But we did this interesting thing, which is about we did 3,200 interviews and about 375 what we call in-depth interviews, where it's just like this. We turned on the microphone and we had people talk.
Right.
And we went back and did a spot check of people who said they were born in California. And we kind of listened to their interviews, and people were just name dropping just the way that, you might if you're just like having a conversation with someone about like,
Right.
communities they grew up in or elementary schools that they went to or neighborhoods they remembered or neighborhoods they were living
Right.
in. And I was like, well, either these people are really, really good about Google research and found this tiny community, like this tiny street name, and like
Yeah,
they
you
were
found yourself
really
a method
committed to the
actor and
bit.
they know the
Yeah.
whole role.
Right. It just isn't true.
Well,
People stay where they are because it's their home, because maybe their community is there, it's what they know. Um,
right. No, that makes sense. I would love to talk to you about some of the challenges around, any policy concerns.
yeah,
What are some
yeah,
of the concerning policy trends you're seeing right now
yeah,
regarding housing and homelessness services,
yeah,
and what's kind of at stake?
yeah. So for many, many years in this country, the standard of care was if you became homeless, you had to earn your right to the next step. And you went through this ladder of steps. So if you were homeless, this was the policies for many years. You were homeless, you might be offered a night in a shelter. And in that night, you had to go to an AA meeting, frankly, whether you had addiction or not, and then maybe you were offered a week in a shelter, and then maybe you were offered a month, and you had to keep going through these hoops. And I've talked to many people who are like, I was like making up stories of using because they wouldn't believe that I didn't. So I just did, and so
Wow.
you had to
Mhm.
like take your medicines, you had to do all these things, and eventually you would earn your way to 2 years of housing. And then if you stayed sober and if you took all your meds and you did everything quote unquote right, eventually you'd earn your way to a permanent house. And what we found out was, sure, everyone who is permanently housed was sober, but very few people were permanently housed. And people instead were stuck in this endless, endless loop of being
Mm.
thrown back to homelessness, where people would then feel like they couldn't prioritize, their mental health or substance use. And it was like, it just didn't work. So in the early 1990s, this really brilliant psychologist named Samson Barris was actually working with a community of people with severe mental illness, three-quarters of whom had substance use disorders in New York, and was really frustrated that it was hard to get people treatment. And he just sat down and started to talk to people like, what would help you address these needs that you have? And to a person, they said, if I was housed. And so he tried
Mm.
this thing where he flipped the switch. And he said, what if I brought you into housing and then wrapped these services around you, but you didn't have to take them? Because, like, if I make people take them, then they're not, right?
Right.
And what he found was like, oh my God, all these people who hadn't been getting mental health services are getting them. All these people who hadn't been getting addiction services are getting them. And nearly everyone is staying housed. That, originally called Pathways to Housing, was sort of rebranded Housing First. And and it really was a comparison to what had been the standard of care for many years, called treatment first, where people had to agree to treatment and that housing was a reward. And what Housing First said is housing isn't a reward for good behavior, that housing is the basis of safety and security to let people move on with their lives and let them address whatever other needs they have, whether it's getting a job, whether it's going to mental health treatment, whatever.
Right.
And interestingly, that, and I say this ironically, that known radical, George W. Bush, um, and his administration looked at the data and they said, wow, in the old system, maybe 5, 10% of people would like get to the endpoint and get housed. And in this new system, 85%.
Mm.
85 is higher than 5. I'll go with it.
Yeah.
And right? I mean, it was literally that. It wasn't a moral
Yeah.
judgment. It was like, this works. The other thing didn't. Let's go with what works. Let's spend our money well. Let's use whatever housing units we have well. That became basically, under the Obama administration, the law of the land. That if you're going to spend federal dollars on housing, you couldn't make it the reward. Didn't mean that you shouldn't wrap treatment around. In fact, it encouraged everyone to wrap treatment around. It just said
Right.
housing couldn't be the reward. That has been the way for many years. We've seen it enacted most prominently in the veteran system because unfortunately there's no right to housing in this country. Most people, like, we're in this deep hole, like we talked about earlier.
Right.
With the veterans, there was a fair amount of political will. Like, it's really shameful and embarrassing that we have people who've served this country on our streets, right? So a
Man,
lot of
yeah.
elected officials of many stripes are like, yeah, this is a bad look, right? So they
Right.
actually put money into the problem. Now, what people may not be aware of is veterans also have access to um, really our only care system, like, run by the government, and it's pretty much open to anyone who's a veteran, more or less, for free or very low cost, the VA system. And so the VA, in the veteran example, they did a couple things. They said, we're going to actually put money into this, real money into it. They said, hey, we actually have a healthcare system that we could leverage. We could identify people at risk of homelessness. We could use those services through the VA system because there's social workers there and doctors there and the like. And they enacted a housing first policy and actually put some meat on it. Not enough money to overcome the huge barriers of lack of housing in so many of our cities and counties,
Right.
but real money. Veteran homelessness in the last 11 or 12 years has reduced by more than half.
Wow.
While every other form of homelessness has gone up because our underlying fundamentals are worse, our income
Mm.
inequality is worse, all of those things.
Right.
It just showed, like, what if we stick to this philosophy? Housing is not a reward, housing is the base. What if we leverage our healthcare system and actually guarantee people healthcare? Crazy idea, right? What if we organize our healthcare system and say, hey, housing is a part of this? Like, these things go together. It's like Reese's peanut butter cup, it's like
Right.
housing, healthcare, these things belong together.
Yeah.
And so we coordinate these. We could actually drive homelessness down incredibly. And frankly, Corey, the only reason why it didn't go down like even more is just that the money wasn't unending, and the housing, like, you can have a voucher, and if there's absolutely no housing, like in San Francisco, you're still kind of out of luck, right?
Right.
But great news. Here's the problem. Where is homelessness worse? Homelessness is worse in cities where there's been huge knowledge economy explosion, lots of rich people where they didn't build housing. Where are those cities? Places like San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles,
Ah.
right?
Mhm.
Those are where it's the worst. Who runs those cities? Democratic governors. Who is homeless? Democratic governor, Democratic mayors. Who is homelessness affect most often? Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, right? This became a perfect wedge issue to try to demonize
Mm.
people of color, to try to demonize people with stigmatized medical problems, and to try to do a gotcha to
Oh.
Democratic leadership. And so there has been this organized effort funded by Joe Lonsdale and the Cicero Institute. You can look it up, where they have actually tried to take what was a Republican idea, a George W. Bush idea, pin it on Democrats, and say that this is causing havoc and social disorder. Like, think of that. Think of like that argument, social
Wow.
disorder, havoc, right? And so this has been weaponized to undermine this incredibly effective bipartisan policy that has resulted in dramatic reductions in veteran homelessness, that is really effective, that has shown to be, much more successful on a person to person basis than the opposite. And basically, it has led to huge outcry against it. We're seeing even liberal cities saying like, oh, we shouldn't do housing first anymore. We should demand people get to treatment. And part of me is like, oh my God, I spent my 20s and 30s in medical training so that I could give people treatment. And let me promise you, I can't treat people when they're on the street. Like, I could have had a lot
Right.
more fun in my 20s and 30s than I did if I didn't
Right.
actually. I believe in treatment too. I want people to get treated. That's why I did this damn training.
Right.
But we can't do it when people are on the street. And that's why housing first works. So right now, the Trump administration is basically completely unwinding housing first and causing real havoc. And that is a tragedy. Now, again, the solution to homelessness is housing. We can't, housing first doesn't work if you don't have housing. And also, by
Right.
the way, people are dying in the streets. We as a system need shelters because we haven't built enough housing. Yeah, of course we need shelters. Like, yes, we do. But what I'm really worried about is this politicized, ahistoric, anti-evidence, assault on truth, gotcha game that's going to lead to so much more suffering and so much wasted money and such bad policies. I'm afraid that it will affect our veterans. We're going to wind up throwing veterans back out onto the street when we reverse this
Hmm.
policy, and it's going to cause incredible harm. And I think that we need the public to be aware of this. We need them to realize that it was organized, it's kind of devious, and that the option here isn't, none of us are saying there should be shelters, obviously. None of us are saying that there shouldn't be treatment, obviously. What we're saying is housing isn't a reward for engaging in treatment, not only because in my moral and ethical system, that's a weird thing to do, but more pragmatically, if you insist on that, you get neither housing nor treatment.
Right. It is maddening to think that such a hunger for power is going to kill people
Yeah,
because they want to control. People want to
yeah,
control a situation.
yeah. It's very sad. I mean, it feels very exploitive. It feels very familiar to other disinformation campaigns. I always want people to say like, what is the source? What is the reason
Mhm.
behind this thing? And then think about what we're contrasting here. We're not saying that, you never build a shelter. Of course we're not. We're not saying that we don't think people should get treatment. Really, of course not. We're saying if you want people to be housed, you start with the housing. And more importantly, perhaps for some, if you want people to heal their wounds, if you want people to have treatment, if you want people to have access to treatment, housing is the root of all safety and stability. And if we put it at the end as a prize, people neither get housed nor do they get treatment. And so, if you actually care about the people, if you actually wanted them to get mental health treatment, if you actually wanted people who suffer from mental health and substance use problems to get mental health and substance use treatment, you start with the housing. Does it mean no one ever goes to the hospital? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean no one ever needs residential substance use treatment? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that if you make housing the prize, you're going to have some weird moral victory and wind up with a lot of people who have neither housing nor treatment.
And I would almost say that it would make access to those resources even easier.
Of course. Of course. If one of the really interesting findings we had in the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness was about a quarter of the people who looked like they probably had substance use problems, 26%, told us that they had tried to get substance use treatment and were unable to get it. So you add that to a lot more people who basically told me, come back and talk to me about treatment when I'm housed, which is a very real and human phenomenon. They're like, I just can't pay attention to this. But people couldn't even access it. So we're having all these conversations about like forced treatment. And people are like, force me, don't force me. I'm trying to get it. I'm trying to get it.
Right.
You're not giving it to me, right? But I know as a physician who does a lot of this type of work, it's just so hard to get it to people when they're
Right.
outside. I can't easily send a nurse to their house. I can't send a letter to their house. I can't ask them to prioritize something that's very hard to do when they're like, Doc, nice talking to you. But what I need to do is figure out where I'm sleeping tonight. I'm hungry. I need to
Right.
figure out where I'm eating tonight. That comes first. It's like,
Yeah.
back to that, like, very like basic ideas of what comes first. People are always gonna try to quench their thirst, their hunger. They're going to try to stay warm or cool if it's,
Yep.
Las Vegas, it's 120 degrees, right? That they're going to do first before you're like, oh, and by the way, it's helpful
Yeah.
for you to take this medicine every day, but you need to go to the pharmacy and yeah, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah. It's low on the totem pole when it comes
Low
to
on
safety.
the priority list for sure. For sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we talked a lot about a lot of heavy things
Yeah.
today, and I'm definitely fired up to continue raising
Yeah.
awareness. But I would love to get your thoughts for those public health professionals,
Yeah.
community health workers, those
Yeah.
advocates, providers that are
Yeah.
listening. What's one thing they can do in their practice or community
Yeah.
to start addressing some of these
Yeah.
housing as a health issue?
I think right now, in the moment we're in, one of the most important things you can do is to raise your voice and say there is no medicine as powerful as housing, is to raise your voice and say homelessness is a housing problem, is to fight disinformation and advocate for your patient's health, and to use your power as a community health worker, as a nurse, as a public health professional, as a physician, whoever you may be, as an EMT, and say, I know a thing or two about health. And this is what I'm telling you, that for people to be healthy, they need to be housed. And that we as a society desperately need to not demonize people who have lost out on these hunger games of housing wars. And we need to build housing. And I think it's really important. I think if I can have a second thing, it's like also important to show up. Like,
Mm,
if your community is talking about building affordable housing, one of the reasons it's so expensive is that everyone fights it so much. And the truth are, there are a lot of people who are like, yeah, I wouldn't mind having neighbors who, have subsidized housing. That would be fine. I'd much rather that than they live outside. But like, you've got something else to do on a Tuesday night. And the homeowners who are quote unquote worried about their quote unquote property values, they show
right.
up and they scream. I say we should all show up and say, yeah, I want my neighborhood to have everyone in it. I want my neighbors to be housed. But really, if people in their book groups, in their soccer, on the sidelines of their kids' soccer games, in their churches, in their synagogues, in their mosques, like wherever people are, if they can say, I'm a healthcare provider and I know a thing or two. I'm a public health professional and I know a thing or two about health. And there is no medicine as powerful as housing. And at its heart, homelessness is a housing crisis.
Awesome. Love it. Dr. Kushel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. For those that are listening or watching and they want to follow your work or learn more and connect with you, where can they reach out?
Yeah. Join us at, if you come to our website, homelessness.ucsf.edu. That's homelessness.uc, University of California, SF, San Francisco, .edu. We've got tons of resources. We do webinars. We've got reports. Sign up for our contact list. We promise we won't spam you, but we let you know we've got new interesting things coming out. Poke around our website. Stay in touch. Educate yourself, because this is probably not in your curriculum in your health training. Empower yourself with what you need to know, and get out there and spread the word. Homelessness is a housing problem. Yeah.
Homelessness is a housing problem. I
And
love it.
there is no medicine. There is no medicine as powerful as housing.
Yes, awesome. Well, again, Thank you. This was so valuable and so informational. Again, thank you so much for being here. And everybody, thank you for listening to the Healthy Project podcast. I'll let you next time. Hey, thanks for joining us on the Healthy Project podcast. At Healthy Project Media, our mission is to connect with the next generation of health leaders and innovators. If you're interested in advertising with us or exploring collaboration opportunities, please reach out at hello@healthyprojectmedia.com. We look forward to growing this community together. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of health.